Our keynote speaker today is Brock Dolman, and his topic is Basins of Relations and Thinking Like a Watershed. Occidental Arts and Ecology Center biologist, educator, and Water Institute director Brock Dolman will offer a series of slides and images, interpretation about water, watersheds, human development patterns, and land use ideas that support regenerative human settlements. Brock will discuss rainwater harvesting as a strategy of water conservation, and will expand on ideas of conservation hydrology and low-impact development, which emphasizes the need in many areas of human development, designs to improve our drainage to retain age. Brock Dolman is the co-founder of Occidental Arts and the Ecology Center. He is a wildlife biologist and has lectured internationally in Costa Rica, Brazil, and China. He has been featured in the award-winning films The 11th Hour by Leonardo DiCaprio, The Call of Life Species Alliances, and Permaculture, A Quiet Revolution by Vanessa Schultz. I'd like to thank Brock for coming and look forward to his talk. Brock Dolman, ladies and gentlemen.
How you feeling, Penticton?
Thanks to the BCWWA, we're good. And Daisy specifically for having me come up, and Anna Sears for originally getting me to the Okanagan a couple years ago and introducing me up here. So I'm just going to cut to the chase while you guys are enjoying your dessert and talk water here. And let's see that clicker. So I'm going to unpack this idea. I'm talking about basins of relations, and I'm really interested in the relationship people share within a basin, or the notion of thinking like a watershed, and we'll get more into that. And at the Occidental Arts and Ecology Center, which is a small 501c3 nonprofit in western Sonoma County, we're north of San Francisco, about an hour and a half, Redwood Country, another one of the wine countries, although you guys are producing some good grade of wine around here in the Okanagan Valley. Been sampling it a lot lately. Thanks to all of the folks hosting these events here. But I run this Water Institute, as you can see there, so I'm interested in watershed advocacy, training, education, research, restoration at the watershed scale. And I guess just because this is I don't usually get to speak to a room full of folks who are such acolytes of water. And so it's an honor to be in this space of folks who really respect and honor water. And I guess hopefully I want to at least support you in recognizing, maybe you already know this, that we don't live on planet Earth, right? We live on planet water. And this is what the amazing planet you live on. The 70% of the surface area of this living planet is actually water. And there's something unique and obviously special about that. And the fun part about water, just sort of continuing into the realm of adoration of water, is imagine a molecule that's actually can be a solid, a liquid, and a gas. Really cool. As a solid, it floats on its liquid self. And if ice sank, then we wouldn't be here, guaranteed. In the form we are as life right now wouldn't happen at all. Imagine you could actually hit that ice and turn it to a vapor without even going through a liquid state, sublimation. The whole specific gravity of water, the energy holding retentive capacity. And I'll talk more about the relationship of the thermodynamics of phase state in a second here. And obviously then there's a water cycle, which is an amazing thing. And so you can think about the noun of water, a solid, a liquid, a gas, or you can think of the verb of water. And interestingly enough, the volume of water on planet water has been finite for 4 billion years. All we got is what we've got. The verb of water is infinite, and that's really different than certain resources. So there's a fixed volume, but there's an annual action in the cycle of the verb. And that's where the fun part about get more into balancing water budgets comes in, is interacting with the verb side of water itself. And to paraphrase a small quote by Jacques Cousteau, basically the water cycle and the life cycle is the same cycle. And get into sustainability, and I was mentioning it the other day at the beginning, the idea of sustainability is really about our ability to sustain the cycles of life. And the water cycle, I would argue, is the most important and paramount cycle to the continuity and flourishment of life on planet water at this point. And I'm a biologist by birth, and that's really how I show up here. My caveat is I have no training formally in water or engineering or fluvial geomorphology. I come to this work as a biologist who was trying to figure out how to support other critters out there, and it became really clear to me as a consulting biologist, do vertebrate endangered species work, that when the hydrologic cycle of a place had been compromised through human land use. The carrying capacity for life in that place was accordingly compromised. And that's for both people and every other living organism, such as these critters that I get to live with in Sonoma County. I had the blessing of going to China a couple years ago, up into the headwaters of the Yangtze Basin in eastern Tibet, and spent a lot of time at 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 meters of elevation looking at these beautiful high Tibetan plateaus and glaciated Himalayan peaks. And it's Buddhist, Tibetan Buddhism there. And every little creek, and if you see these little different demonstrations here, these are little water-powered prayer wheels. So underneath there's like a little paddle wheel, and they divert water, and then they have these big prayer wheels that they're spinning out prayers. And every little creek you would drive around, there'd be just dozens of these. And it gave me a sense of the connection that that community had to their water and how profound it is. And it made me think where I come from in Sebastopol, we have this similar connection to water. It's this deep-seated relationship, right, to the way we honor water. And I guess if the solution to pollution is dilution, then pure water next to a jelly donut shop is a good business model. And then there's this whole world, and I did go to a couple talks today, and I was glad to see discussion around the bottled water conundrum versus what many of you all as water suppliers, as purveyors of water who provide water out the tap, I want to honor all of you who provide really good water out of the tap, because that's really where the action is. And if you perceive that at your community level, your dependence on your future water supply will be delivered to you in a plastic bottle from a corporation, then I think those folks tend to be a tad bit, right? Language is important, and semantics is important, and marketers get that. The beauty of it is that in thinking like a watershed, in essence, from the ridgeline to the river mouth, and from summit to sea, it's the entirety of the performance of the hydrologic cycle within the basin of relation. That's the water supply system. It's not a bottle. It's not a plastic bottle. And it's those of you all facilitating, managing that. And I was glad to see you all are doing the small water systems trainings, and the whole boiled water piece is so indicative of the need for improving that. When it would appear to me, and where I come from down in the Bay Area, when folks feel that they have a dependent, where they don't have to worry about the watershed because they can ensure themselves access to pure water, 3,000% on average more than the cost of tap water nonetheless, they can abdicate their relationship to the land use within the watershed because they don't feel that it has any bearing on their life. So they'll allow for whatever land use, agrarian or urban land use, to occur because they can buy it in a plastic bottle. So the plastic bottle is insidious, not just in its cost and in many cases its lack of actual assuredness on its quality, but that it removes one from being in relationship with your basin. And then, again, as a biologist, I'm always striving to figure out, well, what are the organisms that, if on behalf of their integrity, we can develop land uses that will benefit us? And totem salmon is really the one that I'd spend a lot of time working on down at the southern end of Salmon Nation. You all are sort of in the northern, eastern edge of Salmon Nation up here. And totem kokanee for this area. Kokanee as a landlocked salmon, but when it's allowed to move back and forth through the Columbia out to the ocean, it becomes a sockeye. Same fish, right? And so these anadromous fish become totemic. And we have a wonderful friend who's an author down in California named Freeman House, and this idea that the thing we learned from salmon was the importance of the watershed as a unit of perception. And there's something humble about the notion of honoring perception at a landscape level. And here's the deal, is that the unit of perception that's got to get it is here, and the most important headwaters in the system is the water between your ears. And it's in the true headwaters up here to get that. And so I'm really involved in this work we call ecosystem restoration. And there's ecosystem restoration, but to get to that, we have to have a new storyline, a restoration of the ecosystem, which is really, I would honor, what BCWWA is doing here. It's about a collaborative and convivial container that's crafting a co-evolved, communitarian-based opportunity to rethink how it is that you all, as service workers to society, on behalf of providing water here and facilitating the transference and recycling of water, what's that storyline that you believe in, and then how do we restore that ecosystem? And it's the socio-political, cultural, economic forces that are at work here. Fish, if you let the fish get back up here, they know what to do. Trees know what to do. It's us. I would argue that in essence, and I would propose a toast to you all actually, that it's really you bipedal sacks of saline solution that are ones up for grabs here. And so stay hydrated, people. Somebody who's inspired me a lot, Luna Leopold, who's somewhat of a father of fluvial geomorphology down in the States, son of Aldo Leopold. This idea that the health of our waters is the principal measure of how we live on the land. And so really evaluating the quantity and quality of water in place over time and the efficacy of your settlement in that place, your land use through time, water's the most truthful thing you'll ever meet as far as I can tell. And there's either more of it and it's cleaner for your settlement there over time, since your great-grandparents to you now, or it's not. It's not a political issue. And so if in fact water's that principal measure of how we live on the land, if you live on planet water, then we can expand that to say it's actually the principal measure of how we all collectively have been living on the planet. And in the post-industrial era, it's not clear to me that planet water is that enthused with our dependence on fossil fuels foisted upon us by the oligarchy, if you will. And the science, you don't even need to listen to the scientists to tell you that something's up, right? It's pretty straightforward if you're willing to look. I can tell you in 2008 when I was in Brazil that bathing suit on the right there is very large at Ipanema Beach. And again in 2012, the naked truth of the matter is that it's pretty much game on. And climate denial is the domain of a small number of folks in the world I work in. We call them biostitutes that deal with this. But the planet's running a fever. And there's the physics around it and how a greenhouse effect works, and the emissions that stack up in that atmosphere and make that blanket thicker and retain more heat. And so my average temp would be 98.6. Earth in the last 100 years, we're up about 1.4 degrees Fahrenheit, so I'm running 100-degree temperature Fahrenheit there. And I'll go to work, I'll take an ibuprofen, but the planet is as sensitive as you are to that level of temperature change. And basically, it's the whole notion, as far as I can tell, in the ecosystem of this idea that there's somewhere called away. And you can just make it go away. Well, the sky's the limit for away, and unfortunately we found that limit in the sky. And you can thicken that atmospheric blanket all you want, but there is no away. The planet will retain more heat, and then it will change to accommodate. And so Mark Twain talked about the fact that climate is what you expect, weather's what you get, but if you can't even expect the climate anymore, then the uncertainty principle is going to get really interesting. And any of the modern studies, if you look at them around this descriptions of climate change, like the IPCC here, where it's unequivocal warming's happening, and then there's the global average and air temperature, right, and the widespread melting of snow and ice in this global mean sea level rise. And what I mostly want to draw your attention to is every fundamental indicator of climate change is a water-based indicator. It has to be. It just has to be. That's just basic physics around that. And I want to support you in understanding what those physics are. And then I pulled this out of Watermark, the book here, the recent magazine from BCWWA, which is some of the predictions for sea level rise that are forecast to happen in, say, 2100 here. A meter of elevation, that's, the coastal dwellers, that's a lot. And remember at the bottom it said mean sea level rise? It didn't say nice sea level rise, because when the sea level comes up, it's going to be mean, and you're not going to be happy about it. And as far as I can tell, you'll just have a lot more affordable housing. Is that housing you have to ford through the water to get to? Is that affordable when you get to this sea level rise here? And in the end, as far as I can tell, I just end up calling it global weirding. Because things are just going to get weirder. And the adaptive management and the flexibility around that is going to become increasingly important. And here's basically the equation that sums it up for us. If you understand enough about chemistry and energy, then basically if you take the solid state and move it to a liquid state, it actually absorbs energy. And if you move it from liquid to gas, it absorbs energy. We all know this when you sweat, evaporative cooling, or if you have a fever and you put an ice cube on your forehead. Well, the planet, as running a fever, to break the fever, is going to do everything it can do to do that. So it's going to melt all the solid it can, and it's going to move the liquid into gas as fast as it can. And 2010 was the wettest global precipitation ever recorded at this point, and that's what we're witnessing. The solid's going away and liquid's going to move to gas, and the cycle's just going to go faster and faster to break the fever. And so, as far as I can tell, mitigation is on the the emission side, the CO2s, the methanes, the nitrous oxides, but the adaptation is all on the water side, and it's at a watershed scale. And so basically, if your reality has suddenly tanked here in the vision of the future, then what I'm interested in this notion of tanking is that the salvation in here, metaphorically and literally, is to find yourself a lifeboat and get in that lifeboat. And I would argue the lifeboat, uh-oh, missing a photo. All right, well, something's going to come up. You're going to see that there's a watershed as a lifeboat. All right, that's going to mess up the flow. Basically, then, I guess where I'm at was, I'll hopefully come back to this, is that the land use that we've currently been developing has been based in the drain age, if you will, in the age of draining. And you can look at this image of, we just make it all go away. We're back to the away part. And there's my little lifeboat image. So, bring it back to the lifeboat. The concept here, I think, is that, again, from summit to sea, you live in a watershed lifeboat. And it's all hands on deck and batten down the hatches. And the fun part is that every human land use that occurs within the entirety of the basin, forestry, rangeland, or other forms of ranching, dairy, urban, suburban, rural, mining, is up for a rethink and a retrofit about how it performs. It's not saying take it away, it's just how do we rethink it so that it improves the performance of the water cycle. And so I'm very much supportive of the Occupy movement. It's just about occupying your watershed and your lifeboat. And the lifeboat that here, at least in the Okanagan, is this Okanagan Basin. And so identifying your place and the geography of your place and identifying your connection to it. And then it's really about the ecosystem restoration of doing the work collectively, the policy work, the education work, the outreach work, on the crown lands or on private property. And there's been a very successful campaign down in Lake Tahoe, and I would just support you all in figuring out what is it going to look like to keep Okanagan blue. It's going to be about keeping the Okanagan. That's not about the charismatic lake where everybody wants to come, but the action here in the Okanagan is actually up on the slopes. And I did want to honor and support you all in taking your water challenge here, so do that. And be clear about it. Ultimately, everybody on the planet lives in a watershed, although increasingly folks tend to live in pipe sheds. And that keeps some of you all busy, and you can wrench and put things together really fast, as far as I can tell. But it's an interesting conundrum, the pipe shed thing, and there's either horizontal pipe sheds or vertical pipe sheds. And generally where folks start electrifying the extraction of groundwater with the water energy nexus, we tend to observe the removal of groundwater at rates that oftentimes exceeds the replenishment rate. And falling groundwater levels are epidemic all over the planet. And the interesting thing is really understanding the groundwater, and I know that there's an effort happening in the Okanagan Basin that's starting to really look at that. So if you look at this image here, there's the charismatic lake carved out by the glacier, but really the basin of relation is all the brown and green up on the slopes. And as lake levels go down, if the giant sucking sound is there, then the water rights to suck on the pipe are commensurate to the water responsibilities to slow spread and sink in the uplands and put it in the ground to reconnect to the lake so that you regenerate the hydrologic cycle. And that the water rights responsibility conundrum is really interesting. But here it would appear it's very well connected because of the way the geology works in this glacial landscape, that every bit of rain that lands in your uplands that doesn't evapotranspire or get used for another purpose, if it's able to get in, will at some point connect as part of the recharge to keep the lake system going. And so I often think about perceptually as stormwater, do you perceive it as a problem? Because if you do, you'll engineer a pay pipe and pollute paradigm, or a plow pipe and pollute paradigm. But if you see it as a solution and turn stormwater into rainwater, then really slow spread and sink is where the action is on that. And just for what it's worth for the wastewater engineers in the crowd, this is a regional wastewater treatment plant in the Laguna de Santa Rosa in Sonoma County where I met Anna Sears at. And they didn't plan the elevation on that over time as it was built for all of the increase in the impervious surfaces that happened upstream of this system. So in a 10-year storm event that isn't that big of a storm event, they were within 4 inches of overtopping every primary system in this wastewater plant. It was designed really well, but the impervious surfaces in the uplands is really important. And there's just the land use planning agencies and the wastewater planning folks weren't talking to each other. So I'm impressed at the level of collaboration you all are showing here. So That's where I would have slid in my little, I had my drainage piece, and now I get to move into the retainage. So how do we retain it? Slow it, spread it, sink it, and see the watershed as a sponge. And if you'd like to read more about that kind of work, then study this book by Brad Lancaster, Rainwater Harvesting for Dry Lands. And as far as I can tell, you all live in a dry land. Anybody know the global average rainfall? It's about 15 inches. And what's Penticton's average? From what I could figure out, it was like 330 millimeters, roughly 13 inches, and, you know, obviously up and down there. But, you know, so it's not, it's, your evaporation rate likely exceeds your precipitation rate, and therefore you're in this arena where it's Mediterranean dry land. And so thankfully, there's some very smart folks who've taken this document that we worked on in California, Slow It, Spread It, Sink It, and the Okanagan Basin Water Board and others, Okanagan Waterwise, and I don't know who else took credit for this, but I know Anna and others on this. Get this booklet. It's a great booklet. It's really well done. It's accessible and easy to get to, and full of good ideas and tools in the toolbox for how to think like a watershed. We've been working a lot at watershed scales and trying to understand the relationship of surface water and groundwater and land use. And so this is the Sonoma Valley watershed in the north part of the San Francisco Bay, and it's a recharge potential map based on soils and depth of groundwater. And so wherever it's green, that's the best soils to recharge, and where it's red, it's not. So with limited funding, if we're going to slow, spread, and sink, then let's figure out where can we do that in the watershed. That's optimum. And so just because I get to be out of the box here, and I'll be flying away tomorrow and go back to the States so I won't get hammered, then I get to bring up beavers. Because if you want to slow, spread, and sink water, then evolution, the greatest hydroengineer evolution in the northern temperate zone of the planet has ever evolved as a beaver. And when the first folks showed up here to create Fort Okanagan under John Jacob Astor's fur trapping world, they trapped 3,000 beaver out of the Okanagan the first season. This is beaver country around here, and there was water. And when you got beaver, you got water. And basically, they're often referred to as architects, lumbermen, and engineers. But they're basically forest farmers that manage water because they eat trees. Beavers are herbivores, right? And the beauty of it is that not all dams nor dam makers are created equally. And beavers they do dam building really differently than we do as humans. And so I like this shot from National Geographic in the 70s. I like that they're relocating beavers, and I like the rancher up there kind of snuggling the little beaver. In my world, that's a positive vision to think about ranchers and beavers snuggling. That gives me hope. The folks in Idaho in 1948 had an innovative way to reintroduce beavers in the wilderness. They just put them in little boxes and put parachutes on them and threw them out of the plane over the wilderness and basically just parachuted those things. Geronimo, if you could imagine a beaver saying that when he launched into there. But there's a Haida saying that basically goes that beaver taught salmon how to jump. And where I come from in trying to do salmonid restoration work, bringing back beaver is probably our cheapest, most efficacious tool in the toolbox. And a number of Western states are looking at this. This is a document about climate change resilience and reintroduction of beaver in the high elevations of New Mexico. And one of your own, a Canadian there, the Glynis Hood, who's, oh, it doesn't say, she's in Edmonton there, up in Alberta. But get this little booklet called the Beaver Manifesto. And she's done amazing research and published a lot of papers on the relationship of when you got beavers in a drought, you've got, in this case, 60% more open water than when you don't have beavers. And what we've got is ranchers all over the West lining up to call and get beavers. Because when you got beavers, you got beaver ponds, but you also have the adjacent alluvium that's saturated, and those perennial grasses that the cows are grazing are tapped into that water. So your rangeland stays greener longer, and your forage volume stays greener longer. The quality of the forage is up, and they have access to better water. So the ranchers with beavers are making more money and not having to move cows out, where the ranchers that don't have beavers are selling off cows in the drought. And beavers are cheap. They work cheap. And where I come from, you don't have to get permits for them. You don't have to do like Environmental Quality Act stuff. They are not unionized. They'll work at midnight when the dam fails. And they're great. They reproduce themselves. They teach their young. They have a great education system. And your neighbors here in the Columbia Basin in Washington State it's called the Lands Council. And they have this Beaver Solution, a project. And they put out this document recently about this innovative approach to water storage. And they basically have done some modeling in eastern Washington, dry portions of their lower Columbia here. the volume of water that can be stored in a dispersed and decentralized area, especially in high mountain meadows by beavers, is a very important and significant amount of water that we can't afford to do in a more technically hardscaped engineered process. And so they've been working very hard. They recently just passed this legislation, this beaver bill for the state of Washington, just less than a month ago. And we're working in California. Oregon's got a new beaver policy. New Mexico's on it. The state of Utah has a brand new big beaver management policy. So the beaver consciousness is well underway. And that in California, this is the mantra here because you all are, beaver's a mascot for you guys, but California, people think we don't even have them. So I guess my question to you is, do you live in a water scarce area or do you live in a storage scarce area? And I would argue it's storage scarcity is really where the action is. And so you may look at your roof as an above ground well, and you may be able to see that if you can look for yourself there, but what, 25 millimeters on a 92 square meter surface gets you 2,365 liters of water, which is a pretty good amount of water. Or if I did the comparison for you on what an acre foot, 12 inches on an acre, turns out to be what, 1,233,000 plus liters of water. So with your average rainfall of 330 millimeters, you're basically getting 1.2 million liters per acre. Now you can either squander it, pave, pipe, and pollute it, make it go away and dump a bunch of pollutants into Lake Okanagan, or you can slow spread and sink it. And so water scarcity is a perceptual thing. You can either be scared in the city because you feel like there's not enough, scare city, or you can feel the abundance of water if you interact with it because your buns are dancing because there's plenty. It's just a perceptual opportunity within the ecosystem to manage that. And we work a lot with governmental agencies around in-stream flows for salmonids by capturing winter roof water, storing it in tanks, and then getting people out of the stream in the dry season and living off the roof water for irrigation, and so that we can keep in-stream flows happening for fisheries. And we've done a bunch of projects with the National Marine Fisheries Service and federally funded projects for salmonid restoration. In the little town of Bodega, where the Alfred Hitchcock movie The Birds was filmed at that famous little church, the fire hall has a 40,000-gallon roof water tank to help them fight fires. We've done 25 homes in this community, and we just did the dairy next door, and that dairy off the dairy barn roof, and if you can see the image there, there's the person standing next to those pipes is 6 foot tall, so there's a whole series of pipes that are now buried under the loafing pens of the dairy, and that's 240,000 gallons of roof water that's now stored underground that allows that dairyman to be out of the stream entirely for the dry season, and he gets better water quality, and he gets to go organic certified because his cows aren't drinking in manure-laden stream water, and now we have water in the stream for the coho salmon and the steelhead. So the opportunity is quite there. And then just honoring the work of Betsy Damon, who I went to China with this idea that if water's the foundation of life, it should be the foundation of the built environment. And so looking at the whole green streets movement, beginning to rethink how streets work, nothing in nature mimics a road. A good Danny Hagen's quote. And so how do you rethink the performance of a road to not derange hydrologic function is really critical and important. And China's really into the green streets movement as far as I can tell. Have you recently been there? It's a lot of astroturf, right? I would reference you to a community for two reasons. It's called Village Homes in the city of Davis, which is in the Central Valley, California, right near Sacramento. Average rainfall, 13 to 15 inches, really hot. Probably doesn't get as cold as you all get here in the winter necessarily. And this is a development that was built in the mid-70s to early 80s called Village Homes. And it's a 240-home development. And it's a no-net runoff, 100% on-site infiltration of all water that lands on the site. All homes were oriented south, so they're passively heated and cooled. No air conditioning in the entire development. And they've done beautiful street trees. And I happened to be there just on Easter here a couple weeks ago. And these are what these spaces in between the alleyways of the community access points, what would be the fronts and backyards. And that's 100% rainwater-fed irrigation. It's basically a rain food forest. And friends there have beautiful gardens. Friends they have median strips with almond trees planted in them. They harvested 7 tons of almonds from the street trees alone as a community celebration, 100% irrigated by the stormwater that's being harvested off the roadscape alone. 100% of the system, the water goes in. They raised the groundwater table in the first 4 years by 17 feet. And they're growing an edible food forest where in the fall you're in grave danger of falling fruit. And so this amazing livable landscape on a rainfall regime basically the same as you all have here. So how do we bring the food close, bring the connection close, and then have just a beautiful place to grow up in and play in, and girls in Easter dresses swinging on trees? That's a vision. Seattle is really working on this, and just a couple images of some of the bigger cities doing this type of work. And if you look at, you can read that statement, it's a vision about how to basically take all the water that lands in the city and try to figure out how to slow spread and sink it within the city. And they do something called street edge alternatives, C streets. And you can see the one image on the right-hand side, it's got a wiggly street. So the street width, the city didn't take up any private property. It just, the streets were built really wide so they could encroach into their own right-of-way and add rain gardens, which you can see images of on the left. And they got better parking, sidewalks, 100% rain gardens, no net runoff, water quality improvement, groundwater recharge, flood attenuation, endangered salmonid improvement, and the homes were appraising for 15 to 20% more in that neighborhood than the other neighborhoods where the retrofit didn't happen. So the economy and ecology are not intrinsically at odds with each other. In fact, they're sympatrically symbiotic. And Portland has been doing this. They have combined sewer stormwater, so when it rains, it goes in the same pipe that it flushes. And they have a number of problems with that. And so they were doing sub-watershed analyses there in Portland. And basically one vision would say the traditional paved pipe and pollute paradigm to retrofit that was going to be $144 million. But the community got together and said, we'd actually want to green our community, daylight our streams, open this up, get more vegetation, get more porosity. And so the rethink on that in this case is actually the whole greenification, if you will, is going to only cost 86 million bucks, right? So they're going to save their 58 million bucks up front, plus the embodied energy costs of actually producing all the pipe, and they get all the mutual benefits of a city that's just much more livable and affordable. So again, I think if you work with what would water want and design with water as the foundation, we'll come up with more livable, beautiful, and resilient, flexible systems that deal with global weirding. Los Angeles is doing some big projects like this. They go to the Sun Valley Watershed if you want to look up more about this. But again, they are pulling up old ball fields, making new ball fields, but underneath them they're putting stormwater chambers. And so all the stormwater floods in underneath the ball fields can fill up in these chambers and then is allowed to infiltrate in the groundwater, providing them local groundwater supply that helps them because the Colorado River is drying up. In California, 80% of our water supply comes from the Sierra Nevada, and that's predicted to be reduced by 2075 by 80%. We're going to have 80% loss of snowpack by 2075 in the area of California where 80% of our water supply is dependent upon. So local water supply within your basin of relation is critical. And San Francisco, people know that peninsula. If you're looking north, you take a cross section, so the ocean is on the west and the bay is on the east there. This is from the Public Utility Commission there, and they're looking at originally pre-development. It was a wet, moist, infiltrative place. Then the middle slide talks about its polluted, degraded state. And the final vision at the top is saying they're doing low-impact design because they're not developing. How do they maintain the city in the middle picture but have the performance of the pre-development hydrologic function and condition? And how do they retrofit it? And they're spending a lot of time and energy and money working on that right now. So I guess in sum, my question for you all is, are you part of the solution or part of the precipitate? And as far as I can tell, BCWWA and all of you are part of the solution, and you're going to precipitate the change that's needed. And thankfully, I'm really glad to see the policy wonks in the room here and the elected officials, because if we don't get a hold of land use, then land use and water use are the same thing, and it's unfortunate that somehow that's not understood so well. And I would just support you and step up to the mic and speak truth to power. And if Totem Salmon shows up at your Board of Soups, then that alternative voice to thinking like a watershed, maybe, don't kill the messenger here. So in the realm of what I've called conservation hydrology, I'm looking for a adaptive, regenerative, rehydrative, receiving, retentive, recharging relationship of a retrofit that's resilient, and I would even argue reverential in its reciprocity, so that we can keep the creek clear, cold, and copious for kokanee, is an opportunity to rethink human land use on behalf of the future in a way that's more livable and more affordable. And I think with that, that's what I've got for your lunch today. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Brock. I don't think I'll look at a beaver the same way anymore. They're not just the big furry rat that we should have on our heads. We should try to keep them as our friends. So I'd like now to call upon Carolyn Stewart to the podium for representing the Water for People. So Carolyn, please.